make the best use of our time. Thank you all for being here tonight. If you are having any trouble hearing me, just use the universal symbol of handcuffed behind your ear, and I will sit a little taller and project a little louder. I am Sarah Copeland-Hansis. I'm your Secretary of State, and with me tonight is Robin Palmer, who's our Director of Civic and Voter Engagement. The Civic Health Index is really Robin's major project of 2024, alongside creating the voter guide, alongside the managing the interns who helped us to do a lot of voter engagement and voter outreach during the 2024 election. So she is a juggler, and she can do many things at the same time. And so she and I are going to try to wing it as we go through this this presentation. I want to be really respectful of what you all are hoping to get out of this, because I know that Robin and I were talking about this earlier today. When we published this in December, we were in a different world, right? We didn't know that the United States of America would be in the position that it is right now when we put this out. We thought this was going to be the fun and engaging focus of all of our work in 2025, and it turns out that we're spending a lot of time responding to, reacting to, and adapting to things that are being thrown at us out of Washington, D.C. So I want to be really respectful of the fact that there might be other topics that people would like to talk about in this circle, and really welcome you to think of this as a circle. I'm here at your invitation, and I want this to feel as useful as it can for you. So our thought was that we would talk a little bit about the Civic Health Index, maybe for 15 or 20 minutes, give you some of the highlights that are contained in this slide presentation, and obviously you're welcome to take the book with you if you want to dive in more. And then we can open it up for a dialogue, either about things that you saw that resonated with you in the Civic Health Index, or lingering questions that you have related to how Vermonters engage with each other and with levers of power, or we can talk about larger policy issues and other things that are top of mind for you folks. And I'm happy to be flexible. I'll just disclaim here at the beginning that I'm not the expert on all things that are happening in either DC or in the legislature in Vermont, because I'm focused on Secretary of State issues, but I suspect that we'll have plenty that we can talk about, and could make good use of roughly an hour and 15 minutes. Does that sound like a plan?
Yes.
All right, excellent. So Robin, tell us about the organizations across the top there.
Yeah. We worked with quite a few partners to get this report off the ground. The National Conference on Citizenship is the national organization that does these indexes for states across the country. So we're the 37th state that's completed one of these, and they're sort of the primary holder of the data. So you sign up to work with them, and they give you your rank across the country. And one theme you'll see is that we come in second a lot, and I'll just preempt the question to say that it's not the same state that comes in first for everything else. It's various different states. But when I got hired for this role that was created when Sarah got elected, I was really excited that it's civic and voter engagement. So voting and registering to vote is important, but there's a lot more to civic engagement than just voting. And so we wanted to make sure that we had a wide representation of folks at the table from the beginning. So we worked closely with Vermont Humanities, with the AmeriCorps programs in Vermont. The Center for Rural Studies at UVM was our local research hub. And then an organization called Up for Learning that really does a lot of focus on youth voice helped us with the youth survey that we'll tell you a little bit about in a minute.
I'll jump in on this one. So when we looked at how do we define civic health, we asked many of our partner organizations to share with us how they define civic health. Many people think sort of academically or dispassionately about what does this term civics mean. These are the various definitions of civic health, and the one that really resonates most with me is when people in their community feel that the systems work for them and that they are reflected in those systems. Before I became secretary, I spent 18 years as a legislator representing Bradford, Fairleigh, and West Fairleigh. And so understanding that my neighbors felt better about how things were going when they felt that those systems were working for them and they could understand what was happening and why, even if they didn't necessarily agree with it, they felt civically connected. They felt empowered to participate in that system. And so we have looked at civic health through all of these lenses with our partner organizations, and it's been a fascinating journey.
So I'm gonna ask you for just a minute. Gunnar is visually impaired, so if we could.
Yep. Do you want me
I
to
know
read
just
those?
yeah, if you could
absolutely.
do that, that would be great.
Thank you for pointing that out. High levels of trust in neighbors, institutions, and ourselves is the way one of our partner organizations defines civic health. Trust, belonging, and ownership, and also having the skills required to engage in constructive dialogue. That was a really important one that's come up in many of the communities where we've done these Civic Health Index conversations. Understanding how systems of power work in a community and what the levers for change are. This is an important one, particularly as I think about youth and youth mental health. The frustration level that young people feel when they see these big problems that they don't think the grown-ups in their world are making progress on, and do we know how to share with them where the levers of change are so that they know how to help make the change that they want to see. And then the National Conference on Citizenship, sort of the originator of this project, defines civic health as the way communities are organized to define and address public problems. And Robin and I do a lot of visiting of schools and talking with young people, and I always want to remind people that the point of living in a democracy is that you have a structure that will come together to fix a problem that's too big for any individual to fix on their own, right? You can't build the roads that you need to be able to get from here to the big box store in Burlington, but we collectively have decided that transportation is important to us and we're going to build roads together. So the point of government really is solving those, organizing around how to address these public problems.
So after kind of hearing from everyone and
Go back one second.
heavy thumb, thinking about the different definitions of civic health, we came up with these 6 domains, and that's what we used to organize our report. So volunteerism and donating, political engagement, cultural access and engagement. Those are some of the things that are easier to measure and that we got a lot of rankings from our partner. Like how many hours of volunteerism, do people contact their elected officials? But we as a group decided that those rankings didn't necessarily encompass everything we wanted to encompass in civic health, especially around trust and belonging. So we added these 3 other domains: social and community context, which really is that feeling of belonging in your community, and then media trust and access and government trust and access. And we really saw government trust and access as separate from political engagement. Obviously, there's some overlap in that Venn diagram, but the trust piece felt important enough to kind of call out. And I'll just say, because this report was a lot of kind of curating a lot of data that we got from different sources, but we didn't really have the opportunity to do a lot of new research with this initial report. That the government trust and access and media trust and access are where we have a lot of room, or really all three of those domains are where we're hoping to do more work in the future.
And that's really come to light as we've done these community engagements about the Civic Health Index. Because different parts of the state have different levels of rich social organization. Obviously Barre has a lot more going on than the town that I live in, which is Bradford, in terms of opportunities for people to engage with their communities. And then with respect to media trust and access, we see very much a mosaic of different levels of media coverage of what's happening in different parts of the state. Over the last 20 years, with the closure of lots of small community newspapers that are covering what's happening in your town, everything from who made the honor roll to to what happened at your select board meeting. It's harder and harder for people to find news about what's happening in their communities, and I think that has a detrimental impact on the civic health of the community, which is part of the reason our office has been really supportive of community media more generally, but that's sort of an aside.
So what we'll do now is we'll go through each domain, and we're just going to give you like some quick stats. And then if you have questions, we can take questions as we go. I don't think it has to be like we're not too formal, so feel free to chime in as we go. But we'll go through these pretty quick because we want to save time for conversation. And just know that if you want to read more about it, you can certainly do that in the report. I also have the executive summaries, which are just one page front and back, if that feels a little more accessible than taking one of those big guys home with you. And in that case, that's pretty much the PowerPoint in the executive summary. And I'm realizing as I go to the next slide, the other thing that I want to mention is we were the first state to include a youth survey. So that was the one piece of original research we did. We sent a survey out to 7th through 12th graders across the state. We got over 2,400 responses, which we were pretty pleased with.
Oh, that's the response you got?
Yeah.
That. Wow, that's nice.
Yeah, and so as we go through, we can do some comparisons and see where the adult civic health information that we
Executive
got
summaries.
and how that compares to youth, which is pretty interesting in certain spots. And we worked with Up for Learning. We had about 50 young people come for a day at the State House where they looked at all of the findings from the survey and gave us feedback and talked about why they thought certain things were that way or things we could do to improve certain areas. So we were excited to have that youth voice included.
So in the domain of volunteerism and donating, Vermont ranks 5th in the country for informal helping and 13th for formal volunteerism. This is based on the supplemental census data from what year? 22. I suspect, given the annual floods of 23 and 24, that we would see the number of people, reporting that they were volunteering would jump significantly because Vermonters came out to help support each other in that chaotic time. We rank 2nd in the country for donations to political organizations. That is 15% of Vermonters reporting that they donated to a political organization compared to the national average of 9.4%.
And the volunteerism piece has been really interesting because what we're finding is that some of the language that's used at the national level doesn't always represent the experience of people living in Vermont, where there's a lot of government committees are all volunteer or being or the
yeah.
mutual aid that comes up during a flood, and like the language of volunteerism isn't always sort of seeping down. And so when we've been out talking to people in the community, they say, well, I might answer no to that question, but I do this, this, and this.
Right.
And
I
so,
serve on the planning commission, I'm on the volunteer fire department,
yeah.
Select board.
on the select board, which is largely volunteer, yeah.
So that's something we're hoping to kind of dig into a little bit more in our next iteration.
Not that we're trying to hit number one in ranking, but but I suspect that we're missing a few potential yes answers on that.
And then political engagement, here's where we're ranking second again in attending public meetings and also for contacting a public official. We ranked second, and our big takeaway here was that, you know, if we just got the rankings, we could have like high-fived around the office, and maybe Sarah would have said, oh, your job doesn't need to exist. Like, look how good we're doing on all of this. But what we learned when we dug in was, or when you look just a little closer actually, you don't have to dig in, it's only for people that have attended public meetings, it was only 17% of people that said yes. And so while that puts us as second in the country, there's really a lot of growth that could happen there. And we've been having a lot of conversations around the office of like, well, what's a realistic goal? Like if 17% is second in the country, like where do we want to see that go? And how could we get there?
And how do you port that to other places in the country?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then this is just a quick graph where you can see voter turnout over time. So the blue line here hovers probably around between 70% and up to, you know, almost 75%. And so from 1986 to 2022, during presidential elections, we're sort of pretty steady between 70 and 74% turnout. And then during midterm elections, it's fairly steady between 49 and 55%, I would guess. And so if you look at it, it's just kind of interesting thinking of all of the things that have changed in the world and all the different interventions we've had to try and get more people to show up to vote. It's been relatively steady over time. And
Is that percentage of registered voters?
Do you know what the percentage of potentially eligible voters in Vermont are not registered?
90 something.
We're at 90-something% right now of eligible people being registered to
That's
vote.
amazing.
Vermont has made a lot of changes to our voter registration laws in the last decade to encourage that, in part because it doesn't seem fair to have an arbitrary deadline saying, oh, sorry, the election's tomorrow, but you didn't know that, so you can't register to vote. So, you know, we've done same-day voter registration, we've done automatic voter registration through the DMV and some other state agencies so that when you're interacting with government and you're giving them largely all the same information that you might need to on a voter registration form, those agencies can say to you, would you like to register to vote? And then that can get transmitted automatically. So we get a fairly high percentage of people registering to vote. Interestingly though, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're always coming out to vote. And in 2024, we had a very curious blip of same-day voter registration of Vermonters who had not voted previously or maybe had moved since they were registered to vote, but decided on election day in November of last fall, hey, I'm hearing enough about all of these elections that are on my ballot that I'm going to go to the polls, I'm going to register, and I'm going to vote same-day voter registration. And it was around 6,000 or 7,000 people who did that in Vermont, which is enough to change the outcome of almost any race on our ballot from November of 2024. So it was a fascinating observation.
So how is that going to play with the voter registration regulations coming out of Washington?
Oh, well, how deep into that rabbit hole should we go? So President Trump issued an executive order in March that very closely tracked to a bill called the SAVE Act, Safeguarding American Voter Eligibility, which is really sort of a lie because it's really, when you see the way it's laid out, it's actually making it harder for people to establish that they're eligible to vote. The executive order has had a stay put on most of its sections through court order so far, and our Attorney General is one of the folks who has joined in multi-state lawsuits pushing back against the executive order. First and foremost, because the Constitution says very clearly that the states shall determine the time, place, and manner of elections, and that only Congress may put rules or parameters around that. Otherwise, it's the states, and it mentions nothing about the president as the executive being able to dictate election policy. The SAVE Act, having passed the House, is now sitting in the Senate. It is unlikely to move in the Senate in its current form, in part because secretaries of state across the country, Democrats and Republicans, understand, number one, the states are to determine the time, place, and manner of elections. Therefore, we don't need a federal law telling us that we should prove citizenship of everybody who is on our voter registration rolls. And number two, there is no clear and direct way for any government agency to determine somebody's citizenship. There is no federal entity that keeps a list of every American citizen. There are people who have a social security number who are legal permanent residents. There are people who have been naturalized, who now have a social security number, but they were not born here. And so using this patchwork of, well, you're gonna have to bring a driver's license or a government photo ID, and you're gonna have to bring a birth certificate, and if your name has changed since you were born because you were adopted, or because you chose a new name, or because you were married or divorced, you're gonna have to bring all of the documentation that proves all of those things, is seen by most secretaries of state as an unnecessarily cumbersome federal intrusion into the way we do elections. Even the states who have tried to establish a citizenship requirement to maintain your spot on the voter registration rolls have found it to be largely unworkable. And there are a number of states who've had laws like this on the books for a while. New Hampshire just enacted theirs after the November election last year and found that they had a number of people who tried to vote in their municipal elections this March who were turned away because in many of the anecdotes that I heard, it was because it was a woman whose name had changed since she was born.
See, that's what's got me kind of concerned. Well, it's got both of us concerned because Frieda's changed her name legally. Can you speak a little louder?
Oh yeah, sorry. That's part of what's got me concerned.
I'm not my birth name.
Right.
I've been Siobhan Perricone for 36 years, 35 years.
Yeah.
And Frisia changed their name legally just last year. So
Yeah.
suddenly we're not going to be able to vote. And
Not without, if this were to pass, which I don't think it's going to, the requirement would be that you have that documentation that shows that
so
what your
would
name
your
was.
office then be enforcing that? And would my town clerk then be asking me for that documentation?
The really nefarious thing about the way the SAVE Act and the executive order is constructed is that it would criminalize your town clerk or the Department of Motor Vehicles in doing automatic voter registration. It would criminalize someone for registering you to vote in the absence of those kinds of documentation, which I think would have a really negative and chilling effect on anybody's willingness to be a town clerk. If you know that, hey, I've lived next to you for 40 years, we know each other, I'm just gonna say that your documentation is fine because I know who you are, but yet there's a criminal penalty looming out there for not having seen that. So that's part of the sort of the nitty-gritty details of the SAVE Act that make even conservative Republican secretaries of state say, this is not really workable. I'm feeling more confident that we don't need to worry about this moving right now. I think it's really important for people to stay engaged in this though, because think of elderly people who have limited mobility and less computer skills. How are they going to request official copies of their documentation? How are they going to get to the keeper of those birth certificates? You know, Mrs. Jones may have an original copy of her birth certificate, but it might be handwritten, and the only thing that made it official 80 years ago was the paper crimp stamp that they put on it, which has since flattened because it's been in Mrs. Jones' baby book for 75 years. So being able to assess the validity of this kind of documentation as a barrier to you being able to exercise your right to vote in this country is really fundamentally offensive. And so we're going to keep an eye on this. We are going to continue to push and fight and kick and scream, because the fact of the matter is, this is a solution in search of a problem, because non-citizens don't vote in our elections. When they did an analysis of 20 million voters in a presidential election a few cycles back, they found that the number of incidents of non-citizens actually casting a ballot was 0.0001%. So it's such a tiny fragment of a percent that if you applied that to the 300,000 voters in Vermont over any given election cycle, it would take us 3 full election cycles to get to even one instance of a non-citizen casting a ballot at that rate. And so to think that we're going to institute something that puts all of this pressure on every single one of us in order to maintain our right to vote for that one person every 6 years who might, with malintent or with ignorance, cast a ballot is just it's a disproportional reaction to something that's really not a problem, statistically speaking.
Well, we're talking about good news. One of the kind of more alarming things that came out of our youth voter survey was that we asked young people 7th through 12th grade if they intended to register to vote when they became eligible, and 36% said no. And there was a lot of promising stuff that came out of that survey, so it wasn't all negative. Like, you didn't get the sense that people just like wrote whatever on it, but this really stood out. And I mean, I can't imagine hearing about everything that's going on right now. Maybe it encourages more people to vote because they don't like the idea of all of that, but it must be disenchanting, to say the least, if you're already a young person who's not feeling like you want to participate in the system. And to Sarah's point, like, there's so many, a lot of these people, if they go get their driver's license, might be registered to vote anyway, but that doesn't mean that they're gonna go vote on election day. So I think for my work, this is one of the things that's really stood out as an area where we can do some work.
Do you want to talk about your wonderful experience earlier today?
But to leave on a high note, I spent this morning at Mount Mansfield High School in Jericho, where a law class of seniors did a voter registration drive in the cafeteria from 11 to 1, and they registered 114 students in 2 hours, and everyone was like running around with their stickers, and it was like really amazing energy. And so for me, when like this work feels really hard on a day-to-day basis, doing something like that this morning, I was like, oh yeah, okay. Like, so there's
We can make a difference.
yeah, there's some high points in there too. And I think my biggest takeaway from that was like the energy was infectious because the people doing the registration were excited about it, and it made me think of all the times where it's like one of us, and we just don't have the same. It's different when it's not your peers. So I think trying to think about ways to get the young people that answered yes to be the ones kind of encouraging their peers is what's on my mind right now.
wonder too, with the youth political stuff, you know, the overlap with media trust, because a lot of what analysis that I'm reading of what's happening is, and it's even in my own family, of both sidesism, and it doesn't matter who I vote for, it's still going to be corrupt, and Joe Biden and Donald Trump are about the same. So, and I taught in high school, so I look at that 33%, and I think a large portion of those are kids who they thought they knew what truth was, but turns out maybe not, right? Or they thought they knew what equity was, but maybe not. So they're so confused.
Yep.
There's no anchor, there's no media they can trust. That now,
And there's no understanding of where those levers of power are
Right.
that might motivate a kid who cares very much about the climate or LGBTQ rights or homelessness to understand how to plug in and get involved and to you know to take advantage of the knowledge that they don't have access to, but to make those levers of change pull. And you know, a lot of times when I talk to young people, you know, I will hear those same things. You know, oh, it doesn't matter. You know, it's the wealthy and well-connected people who are going to make the decisions, and it doesn't matter what I think. And so I think this is an important opportunity, especially in a small state where our legislators at least are very closely connected to our communities, to make sure that every Vermonter has the skill set to understand that it's when those elections are coming up and it's when those candidates are coming to ask you for your vote, that you get to ask them, what are you going to do about homelessness? What are you going to do to ensure that my rights are protected going forward? What are you going to do to protect the climate? And you know, that is the big gap that I really see in the way our education system has failed really generations. It's not just today's youth, it's their parents as well, in terms of preparing them for understanding how to pull the levers of power.
I was teaching when they made the decision to take civics out of the curriculum.
Yeah. And I would ask you, to whose advantage is it when the mass of us don't understand how to pull the levers of power?
I wonder.
But when you talked about with voter suppression, which is what it is. I mean, you said quite charitably, I think, it's a solution looking for a problem. I don't think that's the right way to talk about it. I think they are solving a problem, which is citizen engagement, which is citizens understanding their power and using it by suppressing the black vote, by suppressing all kinds of minority vote, by suppressing women.
It becomes really easy to suppress a lot of people
Yeah.
if you put those kind of barriers in front of their
And
ability to get on the voter registration rolls.
And the gerrymandering
Yeah.
and all of that stuff and the redistricting, so you split up entire black communities and they lose their collective power.
I'm being intentionally charitable because
Yeah.
I want to whittle away at
Yeah.
all of the things that we agree upon so that we can come down to the fundamental, like, what's the problem here?
Yeah.
What's the difference that we're trying to
It's a
solve?
rhetorical point, I get
Yeah.
it, but I think it's important that we, the citizens, understand that this is quite intentional
Yes.
and that we need to take our power back.
Yes.
I think one of the things that I took from school, and that this is going to sound very hyperbolic, but our right to vote is as precious as our right to life. And we are so gung-ho about our right to life, but we just throw our right to vote away.
Right. Because everything in the media tells you that it's dysfunctional and it's corrupt and those people are crooks and politicians are liars, and it becomes really easy to check out of that scene when it all seems futile, right? And that's why I wanted to focus on the youth survey, because over the years, I've talked with so many groups of young people who feel despondent about their ability to see change in all of these things that seem so no-brainer. You know, when I was in the legislature in 2009 and we were contemplating voting on full marriage equality, I sat my kids down. They were 9, 11, and 13 at the time. I sat them down at the dinner table because I wanted to make sure that if they were getting bullied on the playground, they knew the truth of what was going on, and you know, this is what we're doing. And you know, I worked myself up like I need to have this really important conversation with these young people, and they were like, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. That's totally fine. Like, oh yeah, because Rhiannon has 2 moms. And I'm like, yes, it's totally not a big deal. You know, but like the hope of our future in a lot of instances is in being able to empower people who are going to be our next generation of leaders to step into that now because they get it. You know, they understand that we don't need to wrap ourselves around the axle about who you want to marry. They understand that, you know, annual floods that impact our villages and towns are not sustainable, and, you know, and we need to work on it. And so, you know, my hope is that we can do more to empower people to understand how to make that change. I got us on a sidetrack, sorry. We're gonna have to cruise through the next
Well, I
couple
feel
slides a little
like
bit.
this is some
Yeah.
of the most
Yeah.
meaty stuff.
Yeah.
But,
Yes. So the next domain that we'll run through real quickly is social and community context. So the idea of, you know, do you work with your neighbors to do something positive for your neighborhood or community? Vermont ranks 2nd in the country, with 31% of Vermonters reporting that they work with their neighbors to do something positive for their community. We also rank 2nd for discussing political, societal, or local issues with neighbors, which is, you know, ranking 2nd is nothing to sneeze at, but it's still only 14% of Vermonters compared to 7.9% nationally. It's hard to discuss political, societal, or local issues with your neighbors, especially if you don't know where they are on a perceived political spectrum.
So does that count people on Facebook shrieking at each other?
Well,
That's
only if
actually
they would
fun.
self-report that they shriek.
Yeah, so when you're talking like 75% in Barre.
Yes, exactly.
well, and that's the other thing that has come up a lot in these community conversations is like, what is the quality of the, like, is this, are these discussions meaningful and by 2 people who want to understand the other side, or is it like 2 people that really agree with each other just venting about the state of the world?
Right. It's hard to know.
I think one problem or concern that I have, and one of the reasons I've been coming to this organization is, as an older gay person, it's hard to fit into the community at all, right? And so when we moved to where we moved, we couldn't make the assumption that, hi neighbor, right? Because we don't know. And then the other part of that is, even for us to have put out a Paris election sign, kind of, you know, there's the guy that lives down the road with the Trump flag.
Right.
He rolls it on the house every day.
Yeah.
So there's a risk there of actual, you know, something.
Confrontation of
And,
some sort.
so I don't want to talk to him unless I'm in a crowd and I know he's not armed, you know?
Yeah.
So, you know, that's weird, and I think about the kind of the story that Vermonters can tell ourselves about our community versus what it feels like now that there's a real stressor on this community.
I have been keenly aware since this 2nd Trump administration of that level of rhetoric and the sort of that watching for that proud boy mentality and half expecting it to really rear its ugly head in a way that would be really offensive to us who don't support that mentality. And other than a few weekly rallies with some people wearing some very interesting Make America Great paraphernalia, you know, it has been interesting to me how little of that really bolstering and in-your-face kind of behavior we've seen. And that's not to say that it won't come at some point in the future. But I want to invite you to think about your neighbor just a little bit differently. Because, I mean, I don't know your neighbor, maybe he really is a scary menace and I shouldn't be encouraging you, but just sort of in general, like thinking about engaging with people who you perceive to be on the other side of the aisle. At this moment, there are people who voted for this president who are hurting deeply because of the policies that have been enacted. And they may be on the verge of or considering that they made a mistake because they're losing their Medicaid or because their grandmother couldn't renew her Social Security because she didn't have the ability to drive to the office, you know, an hour away, or because they have an LGBTQ friend and they don't like what they're seeing about trans kids.
Or they can't get their crops out of their fields.
Yeah. And so, you know, I think as hard as it is, and you know, I see the T-shirt or the bumper sticker that says, you know, have the day that you voted for, and that's funny, and I laugh at it sometimes. I will admit, but I think we also have to recognize that some of them may come back to the center and come back to a place where we don't feel like they're threatening our very existence. I want to hope that.
Although it is, I mean, it's a little, the queer people have been on the outs for a long time, and this phenomenon of acceptance has been a fairly recent thing, and all of a sudden it's more scary now for the youth and all of that. For us old people, this acceptance
Exhausting.
thing was weird.
Yeah.
It was the weird thing. This
Right,
is
and the thought of going back
yeah.
feels
So it's
like,
but it's still a little scary. It's kind of, you know, it's because we're still in a minority. We're still a large, not always accepted, maybe tolerated by a lot more people than we used to, but not always accepted.
And we're actively being demonized and dehumanized.
Yes. And people who are supposedly on our side are still saying bad things or not stepping up for us. And so I can understand Patrick's point about, I don't know who I can trust. I don't know. And so it's a little hard. It's, you know, I live in Orange, and so it's kind of almost a relief because I know who I can't trust because they're just right in my face about it.
Yeah.
And so that's, you know, that's kind of nice, but on the other hand, it's, you know, it's a little scary. But there, you know, I've got people there, so it's, you know, it's okay. But it's just, I understand Patrick's point a great deal. It's
Yeah.
a little hard.
Yeah, just to speak on that really quick, I really believe that Vermont is one of the few places I've lived where I feel like neighbors can still talk to neighbors about differences in a real way, but I can feel it changing since I've moved up here, which is just 3 years ago. And then just in terms of the consequences for our community, with us being actively dehumanized and with the history that we know we have in this country, we know the risks are much higher for us to reach out to our neighbors in that way. Like, your average progressive may have a difference of opinion with their neighbors that feels very important and very strong and powerful, and it is, but it's not the same level of risk as someone who's a trans person reaching out to a neighbor. Like, the level of risk when it's someone you disagree with versus someone you don't see as human is very different.
yeah, that's an important point.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to that.
I think it's like a lot of the theme of this whole project has been like yes, we are doing well. Yes, we're doing better than other parts of the country, and there is still so much work to be done, and like that we can't just kind of settle for like, well, it could be worse as a place to like take a breather, you know. That's just like kind of across the board what we've found. So yeah, the cultural access and engagement piece, has been really interesting. Obviously you can see that, you know, the same question of belonging to a type of group, 33% of adult Vermonters compared to 17% of the national average, they say they belong to a group, which is pretty good for a rural area, but 70% of youth belong to some sort of group. And so we've also talked a lot through this project about the kind of like people in their 20s and 30s that are getting a little bit left out, because there's a lot of opportunity for youth, and there's a lot of opportunity if you're retired, and there's for people that are new to the state especially, and coming into more rural communities, it can be a lot harder to find community, harder to find groups to join. And if you're, you know, trying to dig in at your career or start a family or do any of the things that people are doing in their 20s and 30s, you just might not have the time to kind of do the same things that are available to young people and people that are retired. So across all of this, we've just also been thinking about like what, you know, Vermont Humanities, one of our partners, they said, you know, we're really gonna start thinking about programming that targets like late 20s and early 30s, because they do a lot of youth programming, and they do a lot of stuff that they know that older people will show up to, but like what can you offer that targets that age group. And then the other piece of that, I know, Sarah, you like to say your thing about it's hard to get 93% of people to agree on anything, but in this survey of the annual Vermonter poll, 93% of people agreed that arts and culture are an important part of thriving and healthy communities. And so that is a good starting place if that's something 93% of people can agree on. But what we've really found is since COVID and with some of the flooding across the state, there are a lot of cultural events that have just not made the same comeback. I think everyone who's lived here for a while can think of something that they miss that used to happen annually that just never quite recovered. And so as there's a whole slate of new things to worry about, we just also are thinking about how we can continue to support the creative industry and the arts. And so much of democracy and the humanities are really hand in hand. And even for our office, like we've been trying to work with the Center for Cartoon Studies to do they did our comic books that I can leave some copies of, and they did the graphic design that's all throughout our PowerPoint, and just trying to make things like a little bit more welcoming and fun and less governmenty. So we felt like giving cultural access and engagement its own domain was really important, and also wanting to reiterate that like it is part of all of them. It shouldn't stand on
I have a question related to that. So we know that a lot of the funding for this cultural access is just gone. Like it's gone and not coming back for a while, probably. So do we have any like plans statewide to help bolster the community funding? I mean, I know Vermont is not the wealthiest state, but is that a priority that is being looked at to make sure that we're propping up that the creative sector?
When you think back to the first slide with the logos of the different organizations, most of those organizations have seen a federal cut to their funding, some of them really significant. What I'm observing, you know, because Vermont as a state doesn't have the ability to backfill those federal cuts in these programs, because we already have federal cuts in other critical life-saving healthcare, you know, related realms. What I have observed though is that many of these organizations are seeing really good response from community members in the form of a $20 donation or a $50 donation. And I think the Humanities has almost reached their first goal, which was to partially backfill one of the cuts that they received. The Vermont Historical Society saw a cut to one of their programs that they were using to help local historical societies preserve their inventories and documents, and they were able to backfill that funding for now, for this year, with the generosity of Vermonters. So, we may see a difference in the number of Vermonters who report making donations to organizations or getting involved in some way, because when it's on the ropes, like it is for many of these organizations now, people are starting to step up.
And even just showing up. Like, I have friends that run a music festival up in Winooski, and like they're like, we don't need you to donate, we just need you to come out to these shows that you keep saying you want.
Engage.
Just like buying the ticket is, you don't necessarily have to donate, but just
100%, I can attest. Show up.
Yeah.
wanna-
So let's cruise through media trust and access. Vermont ranks second again. I know this is getting old. In terms of the number of people who report that they frequently read, watch, or listen to news or information about political, societal, or local issues. 78.9% of Vermonters, which is a pretty good percentage compared to 67% of the national average. And interestingly, Vermonters tend to seek out national and local news sources at about the same rates when an issue is important to them. I hope that means that that's because we have a vibrant local news media, or at least enough adequate local news media coverage that people can find coverage of the things that are important to them in their local sources. So there's a couple pie charts here, and this is again back to the youth survey. We wanted to dig in a little bit about youth and their media consumption. So the question on the left pie chart is, in the last 12 months, how often did you post your views about political, societal, or local issues on the internet or social media?
Oh, wow.
And in case you can't read the tiny print, that 72% of young people said they never post their views about political, societal, or
Good
local
for them.
issues on the internet and media. And everybody that we've presented this information to, and ourselves included when we first saw it, we're like, oh, that's not what I thought. Because we have this perception that young people, are getting all of their media from social media, and they're sharing it all in that way. The question on the right is, in the past 12 months, how often did you read, watch, or listen to news or information about political, social, or local issues? And the 54%, so a little more than half, answered that multiple times a month they read, watched, or listened to news or information about social or political or societal issues. So I found this to be a fascinating dive into the reality of what young people are doing and consuming, as opposed to our perception of them as just being on TikTok all day.
Well, and it seemed like when we talked to young people, they were sort of, maybe not all of the media literacy that we would hope has sunk in, because they're still taking in a lot on TikTok, but a lot of them said, well, we don't want to be responsible for posting something that's not true. Like, they at least seem to have, like, that seemed to have been what was the strongest, was like, well, I'm not gonna share something.
But I'm not gonna share it because I don't know if it's true, which I guess is good.
And then the last one was government trust and access, and like I said, this is where we're hoping to, we're hoping to do some more digging in the future, but the main takeaway here was that trust decreases as the space gets bigger. So percentage of Vermonters with no confidence in national government has increased from 2013 at 30% to 2020, it's 51%. But percentage of Vermonters with no confidence in local government in 2013 was 9% and decreased to 7% in 2020. So significantly more trust in local government. And I think when we see all of the rankings second and we think about what Vermont is doing well, I think it is that, like, on any given evening, you could walk outside and see one of your elected representatives and have a conversation with them, and that certainly helps increase trust. The last one here is percentage of Vermonters who agree with the statement, corruption is widespread throughout government in my community, was 19% in 2013 and 12% in 2020. So we are curious what that will look like the next time we This all comes from the Center for Rural Studies Vermont longitudinal well-being study that they do every several years, and so once we have
I'm just dying to know
Yeah.
what the next data looks like.
Can I ask a question about the youth information gathering? Did you break down that question any further? Like, did you find out where they were getting, like, were they reading or were they watching for their, like, news consumption?
I don't think that is, we do have a breakdown for that more in depth for adults in the report, but not in the youth survey.
I would be very curious to see where they're getting their information from.
Yeah.
So when we've done these, I think we're at the end of all the domains, is that right?
Yeah.
When we've done these conversations in various communities around the state, we will open it up at the end for dialogue, for reactions, for, you know, places that you found this to be challenging or maybe not your perception of your community or your experience with engagement. And I will invite that if that's the direction that this community wants to go right now, but I would also just say, you know, what is on your mind? We've talked a little bit about the SAVE Act and some of the other issues that are challenging in the elections realm. I'm happy to broaden the conversation to talk about other issues that are concerning to you, or we can stick to the Civic Health Index. Yeah.
I just have one question since I watched the Brattleboro and then went to the Barre one. So
You're an expert. You
Something's
can give
wrong
this
with me.
presentation now.
Nothing is wrong with you, Dre.
So,
Nothing at all.
any, like how we broke into those little groups and discussions, I know that you are all very busy, but have those answers been organized, and are you starting to figure out ways that you might implement some of those things?
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, they're organized in that they are typed up on a Word document,
Okay,
and
I
then
mean, that's,
sometimes I
yeah.
open it and it
Okay.
lives on my desktop.
And before Robin dives in too deep about where she hopes to go, you know, the reality is we thought this was going to be sort of the major focus of our work in
Yeah,
2025. And it turns out that our partner organizations are now trying to figure out how to fundraise to backfill
Yeah.
funding that had already been promised to them, you know, for which they had programs already started. And so it's been a little bit challenging to figure out, you know, when are they going to be ready to move forward and do some of this work with us? What is that going to look like in this current context? Because things that we thought were possible back in December and January may not be realistic just from the budgetary standpoint.
Yeah, I think this is a very, we're keeping it real tonight. This is my, like, depressing metaphor I've been using with friends mostly, but I've been saying, you know, sometimes it feels like a lot of the things that we had dreamed of in these small group conversations feel like cherries on top of ice sundae that's missing the ice cream now. And it's kind of like hard to know when to push and when to give folks, you know, give some of our partners some space and where we're landing with all of it. Because yeah, just in like the hierarchy of needs, you know, it's one of the prompts that we've done at these community conversations is, wouldn't it be great if? And like that used to be kind of like inviting people to dream, and now it's like, wouldn't it be great if we didn't have to wake up every day worrying about our fundamental rights? And so I think that's, sorry, I'm having my own little existential moment here, but I think the things that have run really true that we can definitely continue to do from those meetings have, I think, a focus on continuing to be out in the community and have these conversations and just invite people to engage with these topics. Feels like that was like the top kind of thing that everyone was mentioning. And there's also been just a lot of focus on like what we can do at a municipal level or a town level to create a sense of well-being, to help people feel more ownership and more understanding of the levers of their town. And I think with everything going on in the world, feeling really intense, the thought of like what people can do that's productive at the local level is kind of rising to the top. We've talked about there's a few towns that have operators manuals, and it's like if you move to the town, it's like here's everything you need to know about this town. Like, here's where your recycling center is, but here's what town meeting is, and here's we've talked about like some training videos that could be kind of fun on like what going to a select board meeting, what to expect if you've never been to one. So
Ooh,
you're
let's
not
do an orange one.
like you're not like scared to walk into the room, you know, you can like have a sense of how to best show up in these different spaces.
That would be incredibly handy as someone who is not originally from Vermont, because y'all do things a lot differently
We're gonna be getting
than
a
what I'm
lot
used
more.
to. Yeah.
I think the thing that, I mean, like, I know no one can do anything right now necessarily. Because
Not necessarily.
There are other things, but the biggest one that I was thinking about with accessibility was like language stuff and for visual people like Gunnar and like those kinds of things. I don't know if that stuff is more easy to do, like if it's mostly
Do
just
you mean like translation in terms of language, or like
that
Plain language?
that, but also layman's terms.
yeah.
Absolutely.
Because I think people that want to engage, that there's like a level of pretentiousness that sometimes scares people away.
There's also like sometimes they
It's professionalism.
well sometimes language is intentionally obfuscating for the actual thing that people are voting for. So if you're reading the language, you have to really understand what every word in it means and what the intent is, or you might end up thinking you're voting for the exact opposite thing that you're voting for.
Case in point, the title of Safeguarding American Voter Eligibility.
Yeah.
But I guess like that kind of thing
Yeah.
right now I feel like is extra helpful because a lot of us are looking at, if we look on whitehouse.gov and we see all this mumbo jumbo, like if there's somebody that
Can translate the
Yeah.
complicated language
I
into
don't
simple
know.
terms. Yeah.
or just more conversations about it, I guess.
Yeah. That's something that would be doable, like on a community level too. I think bringing, like having meetings within your community where someone can come and talk to you about what stuff means, and you can ask questions of somebody who knows what's going on and can explain it and break it down in like a nonpartisan way and say like, this means this, and if you are supporting of this, then this is the way you want to vote, and if you don't support this, then you want to vote this way.
I had to
'Cause-
help a guy at town meeting because he just didn't understand what he was voting on. And he said, so I want this to go. I want them to do this. How do I go? And I said, okay, you want this to, but thank God he asked me because I didn't agree with him, but I told him how to vote and how he wanted to vote.
Yeah.
Instead of telling him how I wanted him to vote.
Right.
Kind of you.
Yeah, it's very kind of.
Good job.
What a good person I am. But just, I could just imagine, but that, you know, he was stopped.
Right.
And so that was hard.
We've been having a lot of conversations with libraries because that's where we've been having these events, and you know, some of the librarians have been like, how can we like keep having these like civic engagement events in our space? And I feel like that idea of like before a big local vote would be like a perfect thing to try and encourage libraries to do.
Right,
Yeah.
because most of our communities will have, like a budget informational meeting. But if that's your city council sitting across the table at the front of the room and, you're in an auditorium with, 20 or 50 or 100 people, that's sort of an intimidating place to ask, well, what does that actually mean? And, so, I would encourage you to, find if you have a legislator in your community who you think does a good job of interpreting in normal human terms what's going on, invite them to a community meeting. If you can find a city councilor or a select board member who really cares about helping people understand, invite them to be a part of an informational meeting in the run-up to that vote.
One thing I've noticed, talking to people here at the center, that comes up a lot and that seems like is an important factor in civic engagement is just the fatigue factor, that so many people are, emotionally exhausted by being alive and facing what the world is like, and also facing personal things, and the personal things that have gotten less. And we're always trying to find ways to help people kind of regenerate that ability to feel up to getting up and going and doing it. Because you talk about all these obstacles to getting up and doing something, like how do we understand, how do we figure out where the levers of power are. The first thing is just getting out of bed and deciding it's worth it to go somewhere. And you sort of touched on that a little bit with the sense that people have futility, but I feel like one thing we'd like to know more is what can we do to help people kind of break that cycle of I don't have the energy to change the world in a way that will make me have the energy. And we're trying to, one of the things we do at the center is try to find ways to bring people in so that they just kind of get that healing and organizing. And I don't know if that's something that's part of this research, and if not, something that maybe could be thought about a little bit, especially in the current context where a lot of what it seems like the other side is doing is deliberately trying to exhaust us so we can fight them.
Flood the zone.
You're absolutely right that is probably an intentional part of this this administration's tactics.
Can you get the question
I think that human beings are naturally social creatures, and it's this is one of the civic organizations that is going to be a shining star on the map of places where people are coming together to solve problems and to find community, because of the work that you're doing intentionally to help people get through that really intense, I don't want to get out of bed feeling. And I think, what I say to people is it's okay to disconnect from the media. You can't fix all the problems in the world, and if you need to protect yourself by just giving that a rest for a while, you should definitely do that. And then find your pod, find your community of people who are working on the things that you care about and who do agree with you on the things that you'd like to see change in the world, and start talking with them, because nothing has ever changed in the world when it didn't start with a group of people coming together and saying, that's not right, we should do something about it. And the resource that you have in this gathering space hopefully gives a physical location where those conversations can start to happen. And I can guarantee you that there are elected officials who would love to come and talk to your group and to share share observations on where those levers of power are and how you can do the change that you want to see. I talk with Vermont elected officials all the time who who want to do the right thing, and if you need suggestions on a particular policy area, feel free to follow up, and I'll connect you with some people who can help.
we have some limits in there because of 501c3, we invite anybody, have to invite everybody and all of that, but we definitely are interested in pursuing that.
We just can't be partisan. We can invite people to talk, but we can't invite like a Democrat to talk about Democratic stuff. But we can invite public officials to talk about civic duty and like explain things.
Right. And you could use that disconnect, and that's something I've advised people a number of times, like, say, Mondays and Thursdays are the days I read the news, so that on the other days I cannot read the news and I feel guilty about not reading the news because I know I'm going to catch up for 2 days. And that's a way to manage your spoons, or to go do things in town on those days. If you give yourself a day not to, then you can trust that you'll do it on the day you will do it, and vice versa. And I just feel like that's something that probably is going to be a bigger and bigger factor in what this is going to look like in 4 years. So maybe something to consider studying too.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all need to give ourselves and each other as much grace as we can, because we're all coping with the daily barrage in different ways. And we all come from a different starting point too, right?
In my friend group, we all assigned, we assigned everyone a topic, and like each one of us is an expert in one of the topics, and we only tell each other the like most important top line things, and then it's like kind of
watch
watch
all the news.
Yeah, you can
Get
you
the
can
lowdown.
feel informed, but you don't have to take it all. And so like I'm updating people about elections related, sort of based on where we're working and where our interests are. But I don't know that it always works. I find myself still getting sucked in different directions, but we were trying to do something intentional just to like lessen the load a little bit.
It's an interesting strategy. We sort of almost fallen into that by accident. Like Jerry was doing some following the legislature, telling us about certain types of issues, and we had a friend who's actually local who was passing his health news, but we never like kind of generalized it to that. Here's the topics. Who wants to do this one?
Right.
And that's something we have.
We have like a separate group chat, so if you want to just like see the cat pictures but don't want to read the political, you can like you can skip go to the other group chat for that.
Well, that's where Discord's good.
Divide and conquer.
So I've got from a community member who's not here that has not well-formed questions, but I'm going to try and toss it out there. And I was actually going to ask the question. I'm curious: are we going to protect that X gender marker in the state?
Yes.
Period. It's not going anywhere, and that's the state can protect that.
Yes, and the step one, while we wait to see whether the federal government has the authority to tell states what they can and can't do with an X gender marker.
I just want to say I really deeply resent being put on the side of states' rights right now. I really resent that. But okay, go ahead.
Well, unfortunately, a lot of what this administration since January has thrown at us are executive orders that, it really remains to be seen as they make their way through the court system, whether that's even legal. And this may be one of them. But what the legislature did, that I'm not sure has been signed into law yet, but is in the miscellaneous transportation bill, so I'm sure that it will be, is that they have made it possible for anyone to extend their driver's license and get a 4-year driver's license as a bridge to get us through the next 4 years. And what that means is that previously you had to wait until you were 6 months to expiring before you could renew your driver's license, which might mean, next year you lose your driver's license, and if something came down from the federal government that said Vermont could no longer do that, then that could be a risk. The legislature is saying now you can go right away, get yourself a 4-year driver's license, and we'll weather this storm and figure out what's next in terms of protecting the ability for people to have the correct gender expressed on their driver's license.
They just had the second reading for that on Tuesday.
Oh, see, you're ahead of me. I love that. Good job.
Related to that, what is up with the real IDs Because I saw something, I heard nothing about it, and then all of a sudden it said you have to have a real ID.
Yep. Yep.
So
So a real ID was enacted by Congress, I don't know, a decade or more ago,
Yeah.
and it was supposed to be a way of ensuring that that you are who you are when you get on an airplane. So to make it harder for terrorists to fly planes into tall buildings. It has taken this entire time for that to be effectively instituted to the point where they can make it a requirement. And now, if you don't have a real ID, you might be subject to additional screening at the airport. I'm not yet hearing that they're literally saying, no, you can't get on your airplane, but they might, do a more in-depth bag check and physical screening and whatnot.
but it's just for flying.
That's just for flying,
Okay.
yeah.
Thank you.
So another part of this is, a number of our members of our community are on disability, they get Medicaid, and they're scared. And do we know if Vermont is gonna be able to do anything to help protect Medicaid or backfill, or make sure that these people don't die because they can't get life-saving medication?
This is a big budgetary question that, is not, it's not in my level of understanding of what we're seeing for cuts to be able to say with any sort of definition, whether that's a yes or a no. I know that there is a great deal of motivation on the part of people who are, or at least the majority of people who are elected to your legislature, really believe that healthcare is a basic right and that we ought to do everything that we can to maintain healthcare coverage for people. The reality is we get a tremendous amount of money from the federal government in order to help support Medicaid and Medicare and other healthcare programs. And so I don't think that we know at this point whether people are going to end up being dropped off the rolls. The budget proposal that has passed the United States House would definitely have an impact on the states. And what we do if that becomes the reality is going to be a question for the governor and for next year's legislature. And I think, I'm not being political, I'm telling you where the levers of power are right now. Mm-hmm. Your legislature is gonna go home in a week, or maybe the end of this week, but definitely by next week, they're gonna leave Montpelier. Aren't you hoping that they will, so you can stop having people get into their email that they've been locked out with again for the third time this week? They're gonna go home and back to their communities and probably back to their other job. And then it's going to be the governor who is running things, maintaining things, and prepping for next year's budget. And I have observed a reticence on the part of this governor to do things that I've seen other governors do.
Sorry,
Reticence, hesitance, unwillingness to be confrontational is what I'm observing.
Okay. Thank
And we've seen in the news other governors who've been like, we'll see you in court then, or something provocative or antagonistic about federal cuts or federal impacts to states. I'm not seeing our governor doing that, but our governor does need to hear from people who will be impacted if the budget that he presents to the legislature next January simply passes through these cuts and just says, nope, we can't, there's nothing that we can do
We
about
have friends who are going to die. It's that simple. They will die without their medication. And there's no sugarcoating that for the governor.
Yeah.
I mean, speaking of the governor, where is he? What is he doing? Because the only thing I've heard from him was when he signed the bill about medical debt and his remark on this was, well, this will make people more reluctant to pay their bills. And I'm like, what? Or how he said it. He was a little more diplomatic about it.
Yeah.
But I've waited 4 months for him to say this. This is all I'm hearing from this man. Where is he?
We'll invite him to the Rainbow Bridge Community Center and let him answer that
get him
question.
down here. We'll give him an earful.
Can I wear a disguise? Because I want to see that.
So yeah, I'm hearing this from a lot of people. It's not
Yeah.
just me.
Yeah.
I'm particularly irked by
Well,
it.
you know, the reality is that we need leadership from our governor in order to make a plan for where we're going to go. Legislators were trying to gather in small groups and invite folks to come in to help talk about some of these federal impacts, because they weren't getting information from the executive branch on where they see the impacts and where the state agencies are planning or preparing for the inevitability of certain kinds of cuts. And that's just a really inefficient way to plan for the future when you have citizen legislators who are juggling other jobs that they do for 6 or 7 months out of the year, trying to gather up all that information versus an entire state workforce that could be helping us gather that information now. But that is the directive of the governor, to ask people to start preparing and planning for those things. And so I would ask him if I were you. No, but you could craft a letter and find members of the community here who want to sign on to that letter asking for information.
Okay, Gunner.
There you go. I mean, I'm not meaning to make things difficult for someone in a political context, but I hear you, and that's where the lever of power is, that's going to be able to help Vermonters understand how we adapt if we're seeing big cuts to Medicaid.
Call the governor's office.
828-3333.
Thank you very much.
It's been the same for 30 years. That's why I remember. Not because I call the governor all that often. Any other questions from community members or questions from folks who are in the room, even if it's off topic or out of left field or something that we haven't talked about yet?
Is there any structural support that could be provided to communities who are interested in engaging in sort of humanizing conversations across political divides?
Yeah, there's like a couple of different projects going on around the state that I'm familiar with.
Outside of Burlington?
Yeah, both of them are the ones that came to mind. Well, one is a woman named Meg Mott, who is a former professor at Marlborough College, who has really she hasn't cornered the market, but she's well known for dialogue across difference, and she was doing some really interesting work at libraries last year, going around and having conversations about abortion rights and bringing people together who disagreed, and all sitting in the room and really getting into it and modeling respectful disagreement. And I know she's doing a lot of work in that space around the state. And then there's this other project that's just getting off the ground called The America I Want, and it's students working with community members and asking them for 2 words that represent the America they want, and then building these word clouds across different geographical areas and seeing the differences of what different age groups or people in different areas are saying, and trying to then bring people together to look at those and have dialogues around it.
Yeah, I've been talking in my community trying to get something like that going, because I think we're having a little bit of a shift in the culture in my community. I live in Northfield, and there's starting to be friction around the changes in Northfield because it's becoming more progressive, and I think getting folks to talk to each other instead of yelling about each other would be really handy.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I will say when this job got created and I first came into the role, it's been 2 years now, every time I sat down with someone in my first 6 months, it was sort of like, what do you see are the needs, where are their gaps? And I feel like the difficult conversations one always comes up, and it's not solved because it's really hard. It's like the hardest one, and so but thanks for the reminder again, because it's like, yeah, it's kind of the crux of a lot of it, and maybe we can do some work. Like, it's also thinking about when it makes sense for the statewide government entity to put their hand in something and when it's better to keep out of it. But I think that some of these cool things that we've seen going on, maybe we can just
share.
raise the profile
Yeah.
and share it out a little bit.
Yep.
Because get more people involved that way.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you. Anybody else?
The America I Want is end project is happening next week, so we can hopefully share out about that. But that's at Twinfield, just to
Awesome. Yeah.
geographically place the two, Brattleboro and Twinfield.
Well, I want to thank you for the invitation to come. This has been a passion project of mine since I became Secretary of State, because I really believe that when you live in a democracy, it works better if all of us understand how it works and how we fit into it. And so the Civic Health Index has been a fun project, and we see it sort of as a snapshot in time. Where are we right now according to this data? And then engage with different groups around the state to say, what do we do with this? Where should we go with this? What should the next set of priorities be? And we're sort of in a holding pattern right now as we figure out how to bring the band back together, so to speak, with all of our partner organizations, sort of being in budgetary flux and existential flux. But what is the best way for responses and reactions? Is there a link on our website that?
Yeah, if you go to our main website, which is probably the easiest take-home version of that is on here. There's a QR code that would take you right there. My contact information is also on this one pager, so you could reach out to me directly. But the website has recordings of all of our community conversations we've had so far. It's where we'll continue to share kind of findings and next steps. And there's also an anonymous form there if you want to provide the kind of feedback to things we talked about tonight, but you don't necessarily want to do it with your personal email directly to me. You can fill out an anonymous form on there as well.
So if you're contemplating this on your drive or walk home and have observations or thoughts or suggestions that you'd like to make, we welcome you to do that.